summer 1940, southern England. The shoreline faces a narrow band of sea, and beyond it lies a continent reshaped by conquest. Church bells can still be heard in quiet villages, yet each afternoon the air trembles with sirens and the distant note of approaching engines. Families fold blankets into shelters before dusk. Newspapers arrive with thin type that hints at shortage and strain. Train stations pin up evacuation timetables. On the coast, small towns dim their lamps and cover windows. The sky becomes the deciding ground, not fields or ports. Daylight brings scattered raids and hurried scrambles. Night brings searchlights and the dull thud of explosions that seem far, then suddenly near. The official story highlights planning, discipline, and a web of early warnings that knit towns to command rooms. An alternative reading, suggested by diaries and local council minutes, points to improvisation and moments of near collapse that may have been concealed by calm announcements. This program is a work of historical reconstruction. It is speculative and dramatized for clarity, built from published archives, public recordings, and surviving field notes. Names of specific equipment are not used here, and the emphasis remains on credible atmosphere, civilian routine, and the measured pressure placed upon young crews and the communities that supported them. Listeners will hear a measured account that avoids final claims and respects uncertainties. The air war over Britain may have hinged on skill and courage. It may also have hinged on weather, fatigue, and a series of misjudgments across the Channel. Our path through the evidence begins at the moment when anticipation turned into sustained strain. In the first weeks after France fell, households across Kent, Sussex, and the Hampshire Downs tried to keep routine steady while the calendar shifted from early summer into a season of watchfulness. And the Channel became both moat and warning line. Shopkeepers swept thresholds each morning. Children queued for milk with small tin tokens. Town clerks filed neatly stamped notices about blackouts and window coverings. And bus conductors reminded riders to carry cards that listed blood groups and addresses, while it scattered grass strips cut from farmland. Ground crews moved with the economy of habit, checking fuel, replacing worn parts, and scanning the ends of the runway where hedgerows hid a view of low country. The rhythm was practical rather than dramatic, yet the tension built each afternoon as the sea haze lifted and distant shapes appeared, first as doubts, then as points, then as the kind of certainty that pulled telephonists upright on their stools. Official statements spoke of a system that connected observers to controllers with smooth efficiency, though contemporaneous bureau records and clipped radio bulletins suggest the system still had seams, especially when fog or coastal glare confused the human eye. Sirens sometimes sounded early, sometimes late, and there were evenings when nothing came, leaving streets dim and still, as if the island had exhaled and decided to wait another day. The countryside adapted in plain ways. Laundry taken in before noon in case smoke rolled over the valley, tea brewed stronger to steady nerves, matches struck with care so light would not leak past the edges of tape. On station platforms, evacuee columns stood with string-tied parcels, while chalkboards named inland destinations that felt both safe and utterly foreign to those who had never left the coast. Workshops practiced fire drills with pails and ladders, and parish halls gathered volunteers who would guide neighbors to trenches behind allotments. In these same hours, briefing rooms revised patrol charts that looked simple from a distance, lines, arrows, time slots, yet concealed the likelihood that any neat plan might bend under stress. Official histories later offered a picture of near-seamless anticipation, yet field officers' weekly summaries indicate that coverage could thin without warning when weather changed, when engines refused to start or when crews returned too shaken to fly again that day. The island's defense, as lived by civilians, felt like a balance between discipline and chance, a balance that might hold if the next raid was small, or break if it was not. The final week of July brought heavier probes that tested this balance without cracking it, and the bridge from unease to continuous action formed almost unnoticed, as if one particularly crowded afternoon simply extended into the evening and then into the following morning. Two kinds of written traces helped fix this change: the dry cadence of borough council minutes noting shelter occupancy and glass shortages, and the clipped pace of national broadcasts that acknowledged damage without inflaming panic. By the last day of the month, the channel horizon had become a daily barometer of risk, and the roads to the small airfields were dusted by convoys that avoided headlines and preferred to pass at dawn. Crews slept in dispersed huts, mess halls served meals that grew thinner, and mechanics learned to work with what they had, not what they wanted. Nothing here was grand, yet the sum of ordinary tasks shaped the island's readiness in ways that were hard to see but impossible to ignore. As the calendar turned again, the morning brief mentioned larger formations and the likelihood of repeated tests along the same corridors of sky. And the next scene opens with those predictions proving correct over the farms and coastal towns of the southern counties. The first sustained sequences arrived in layered waves that traced known approaches across the downs and river estuaries. And the difference was felt not only in the volume of engines, but in the length of engagement, which stretched from a brief alarm to a full day, measured by the rise and fall of sirens and the short, tense gaps between them. On the ground, wardens guided pedestrians from market streets into shelters marked by chalk arrows. Tram operators coasted to a stop at prearranged points, and hospital porters cleared corridors, while nurses pulled curtains against sudden bursts of daylight that fell through broken fan lights. The defense answered from scattered fields with rotations that shortened as fatigue accumulated, and what had been a measured schedule began to look like a chain pulled tight, where every missing link forced another to carry more weight. The public account of these days emphasized coordination and resilience, and both were real. Yet the counterpoint emerges in private notebooks from station clerks and in clipped dispatches that describe radio confusion, occasional misread plots, and the distracting smoke columns that made orientation difficult at altitude. The human body entered the story in quiet, unheroic ways: dry throats, aching hands, and the small tremor that comes after the last burst of adrenaline. Crews returned to find wheels changed, glass replaced, and fuel measured to the quart because deliveries did not always arrive on time. If planning had drawn a grid across the South, the raids of August wrote in a different hand, feeling their way around edges that seemed firm on paper but elastic in the air. Towns learned new rhythms: an attack before lunch that cut into the bakery schedule, a pause in late afternoon that let workers sweep broken tiles from tram lines, a sudden return after dusk that drove families to basement steps with blankets, pencils, and the habit of wrapping a kettle in a towel to keep it warm. The two indicators that hold their weight in this stretch are the national bulletins that named districts hit in neutral cadence, and the station duty logs that timed launches and landings with minute-by-minute precision. Pairing them shows how official balance was maintained at the edge of disorder, not far from it. The enemy did not find collapse, yet they found stress, and stress turned to loss. When a relay failed, when a warning came late, or when a crew misjudged height in haze. The map in the briefing room accumulated pins so quickly that officers removed old ones to keep the surface clear. Fatigue took a different form among civilians, where sleep arrived in fragments and conversation narrowed to practical concerns: water, bread, the safest route to the shelter near the churchyard. The weather intervened often, reshaping plans on both sides, and there were days when sudden cloud saved an airfield, and nights when clear air hurt a city. Debates in London, recorded in brief memoranda rather than dramatic speeches, weighed reinforcement against dispersal and faced the arithmetic of trained manpower, which some notes imply was closer to exhaustion than later accounts admitted. Over the southern counties, smoke hovered low. Sirens sounded more often than church bells, and the soundscape turned the ordinary into a measure of risk. A train whistle meant the line still worked. A milk cart meant the road was clear. A radio set still playing light music meant electricity had returned. Crews found themselves learning by repetition, not by manual, developing a sense of when to climb, when to turn, and when to cut losses because the day offered no margin. The raids intensified, then ebbed, and then returned with a different focus. And as August shaded into early September, the balance shifted toward the airfields themselves, where grass scorched and sheds lost roofs, and our next scene remains on that front, where the network that fed the defense faced its hardest hours. By early September, the attackers concentrated their attention on the chain of fields and the lines that connected them to plotting rooms and telephone exchanges. And the effect was to compress time for everyone who worked within that network. Waking hours no longer followed the clock, but the next warning, and rest became a narrow margin taken in chairs, on benches, and wherever noise briefly fell to a background hum. Maintenance crews faced a daily puzzle of parts and priorities, moving machines to dispersal points when the horizon hinted at trouble, then dragging them back by tractor or manpower when the danger passed. And the rain of fragments that followed each raid left hazards across grass and gravel that had to be cleared by hand. The official picture from later histories presents these days as a carefully risked balance, where damage was accepted, but control preserved. Another reading emerges from station diaries and clipped memoranda, which suggests the balance was not always deliberate, that sometimes control survived because weather thickened at the right hour, because an attacking group turned late, or because a single runway remained serviceable by luck more than intention. Fatigue shortened tempers in messes and offices, and small mistakes grew more likely, yet the system did not buckle. Communities near the fields adapted to a second kind of routine, where washing lines were avoided in case hot fragments fell, where children were kept indoors during the morning peak, and where the evenings were spent mending windows with tape and cardboard so daylight could be managed if glass failed again. Two credible traces of this pressure remain clear: station duty logs listing repeated launches with shrinking intervals, and county council reports that counted displaced families and requisitioned timber. The consequence was a defense that looked frayed at close range, but unbroken at distance. Pilots walked to their machines with movements that had become spare and economical. Briefing notes grew shorter, and the sense of calculation tightened around essential aims: rise, meet, break, survive to rise again. The attackers believed the stress would reach a point where the network could no longer hold, and some days seemed to point that way, with communications interrupted, with fires near control huts, with ambulances edging past craters to reach the village surgery. Yet dispersion, routine, and plain stubbornness made a wall that could bend and not quite snap. On a few afternoons, an entire sector seemed at risk. And in those moments, a picture of near defeat appears in the private notes of duty officers who wrote in clean, tired script that reserves were thin and relief uncertain. Weather then turned the page by bringing low cloud that muffled engines, or a brief squall that broke up a third wave. And the network used that respite to patch lines, sweep fragments, and coax enough machines back to service to claim the next hour. In this period, public broadcasts remained calm and brief, naming districts and assuring continuity without denying loss. And their tone helped the civilian ear pick a path through rumor. Factories inland continued shift work despite interrupted deliveries, adopting a method of staging output near shelters and using hand carts when lorries could not pass. What kept the fields alive was not any single stroke, but a fabric of practices too ordinary to decorate: the habit of keeping tea hot, the discipline of silence when warnings were passed, the drilled knowledge of where to run when the sound changed. Viewed from the coast road at dusk, the airfields looked subdued, with low lights shielded, with crews moving as if through rain even when the sky was clear, and the evening paper tucked under an arm as if a normal day might still be recovered. On the edge of this sustained assault, a new phase gathered shape when the attackers, frustrated by the endurance of the network and tempted by symbolic targets, shifted more of their effort toward the cities. And the continuity of our account follows that turn from the fields to the urban grid, where shelters filled, transport paused, and the nights acquired a different weight by the river and the docks. The first nights of concentrated bombing over the capital and major ports altered the island's sense of time, pulling daylight routines into darkness and pushing endurance from hours into weeks. As sirens began before dusk and often resumed near midnight, and shelters filled with neighbors who had spent the day sweeping glass and would now try to sleep on benches while the earth trembled. Narrow streets near docks, warehouses, and rail yards learned the order of events by sound alone: the distant hum, the rising note, the crack that rolled along terrace roofs, the quick burst of hoses, and the hollow pause that fooled a few into thinking the worst had passed. For many households, the choice was between the shelter at the end of the street and a cellar that felt too close to the house above. And families made the decision each night with a logic that combined habit, proximity, and the faint hope that routine itself could protect them. The official voice on the wireless kept its cadence steady, naming boroughs and districts in a tone that carried authority without urgency. While Home Office circulars, one of the two indicators that hold weight here, recorded shelter usage and damage to utility lines and tables that seemed detached from the smoke, but were, in fact, made by clerks who could smell it from their windows. The other trace city council incident logs listed fires, water mains, blocked roads, locations of rest centers, and the times when tram service would resume. And those records suggest that even in the most damaged quarters, movement and repair never fully stopped. The aim of the attackers appeared to combine pressure on industry with the hope that civilians would break. Yet diaries recovered from libraries and parish offices speak to a more complicated mood. Fear, yes, but also a practical focus on small tasks that knit a sense of control out of simple acts: folding blankets before dusk, tying a label to a child's coat, placing a thermos where it could be reached by touch. Wardens learned to move quietly from doorway to doorway with torches shaded by their hands. Fire watchers listened for sparks on rooftops, and buses waited under bridges between runs to keep their windows intact. In the river districts, barge crews anchored away from the most obvious moorings and watched embers drift over the water, like a weather shared by every quay from the estuary to the bends upriver. The official narrative would later say that the shift to civilian targets gave the airfields a measure of relief, and a parallel reading holds that it gave the defenders a chance to steady their rotations and mend their network. But those inside the cities found little relief. Only a new routine of night that turned mornings into inventory: whose shop was open, whose rooms were roofed, which road could carry a lorry past a crater without losing a wheel. Church halls opened for tea and blankets, and schoolrooms became rest centers, with chalk still on the blackboard beneath new lists of names and addresses. There were false lulls when an hour passed without noise, and people dared a short walk to check elderly neighbors, followed by renewed waves that caught pedestrians in the open. And stories born in these minutes later became the soft core of public memory. Yet the record shows a steady discipline. Buses rerouted in the dark, wardens counted heads without drama, and hospital porters learned which corner absorbed shock best when windows shook. A second layer of uncertainty rested on those who still worked near the docks and yards, because many had to be on shift during the same nights when alerts were most frequent, and they moved by habit through corridors lit by shaded lamps, carrying tools and documents as if the day had been pushed forward by several hours. The city became a map of workarounds: footbridges built from planks where stairwells had gone, hoses run along gutters because side streets were blocked, messages sent by bicycle when telephones failed, and none of it felt extraordinary to those who did it because everything else had also become a workaround. The attackers, frustrated by the absence of collapse, extended the pressure, but extension also spread their effort over time and space, and any campaign that spreads has to accept moments when its edge goes thin. There were nights when the cloud base reflected the light back onto the streets, making the damage look larger than it was. And there were mornings when the sun revealed a quarter that survived almost untouched because wind and chance drew the bombardment elsewhere. The city answered each dawn by sweeping, listing, and reopening, and the hum of trams or the squeak of handcarts became signals that the day could proceed, if not as planned, then at least in a shape the ear recognized. By mid-September, the contrast between the calm tenor of national bulletins and the gritty detail of council logs had become the frame through which officials made decisions about shelter policy, evacuation routes, and repair priorities, and this frame, however imperfect, let a measure of order sit inside disorder. People learned to carry a small bag with papers, a pencil, and a biscuit, and to sleep in layers so they could move quickly when the bell sounded. Nights gathered a separate life with its own rules, its own greetings, and its own rituals by stovelight. The view across the river at dawn kept faith with the idea that the city still held, and the transition to the next phase stood in the background of every morning meeting, whether the focus of attack would persist on the urban grid or swing back once more to the network of stations and fields. A question that was not asked aloud in council chambers, but can be inferred from the timing of transport orders and the quiet movement of supplies toward the southern approaches, where our account now turns as the calendar continues without pause. As the weeks of night pressure accumulated, the population rewrote daily life into a pattern that appears simple on paper, but felt complex in practice, beginning with mornings that started earlier than before because sleep had been broken and work had to resume on time, moving through afternoons that compressed errands and repairs into a narrow window before dusk, and ending with evenings that were no longer social hours, but periods of quiet preparation. The index of adaptation shows in two places that remain credible: Ministry of Information broadcasts that announced adjustments to shelter guidance and transport timing with an even tone, and municipal supply ledgers that track timber, glass, and coal in lines that never quite matched demand but seldom fell to zero. These traces suggest that endurance was built from small, repeatable acts: boarding a window, memorizing the route to the nearest shelter, keeping a notebook where addresses and family locations were updated each day, and that the public stance of calm was supported by a web of volunteers who handled the unglamorous arithmetic of beds, blankets, and buckets. Schools in safer districts absorbed evacuee classes by adding afternoon sessions. Factories arranged shifts so that one group could rest during the early hours, and parish halls held collections of boots and coats for those whose homes were too damaged to keep clothing dry. None of this felt like victory or defeat. It felt like the work required to keep a city functional under sustained strain. The defenders in the air benefited from the shift away from their stations, and the network redesigned its rotations with a focus on preserving experienced crews, a choice hinted at in station memoranda that asked clerks to reduce non-essential tasks and to stagger briefings. Whether the attackers intended to force such changes is unclear, but the effect was to give the defenders room to steady their hand, and once steadied, their responses began to show a rhythm that survived shocks that might have shattered a less practiced system. Civilians noticed the difference not in headlines, but in the pace of alerts, and the sense that daylight grew slightly safer along certain corridors of sky. Evidence for this perception can be found in tram schedules that resumed near-normal intervals on routes previously cut by daytime warnings, and in shop hours posted in window frames that had been repaired with tape and carefully scored cardboard. The city, encountering damage again and again, turned resourcefulness into policy. Libraries opened reading rooms as study spaces for those displaced from homes. Cinemas staggered matinees to avoid travel bottlenecks, and restaurants shifted menus to use what could be delivered by rail instead of road. At the edge of all this planning ran the raw experience of loss, which the narrative acknowledges without dwelling on, as private letters recorded empty chairs at kitchen tables, and the habit of leaving a light scarf on a peg where a coat had once hung. Endurance, in this sense, meant learning to carry absence without letting it paralyze function. In the streets near the river, piles of brick were sorted by size because intact bricks could be reused, and water was rationed by district on days when mains had failed. The rhythm of the warden's knock, 2 quick taps, then 1, became a signature that let households relax when voices were familiar. Meanwhile, the attackers confronted the reality that extensive bombardment could punish, but did not necessarily produce the foreseeable effect on morale or output, and they adjusted again, sometimes striking further inland. other times returning to the ports as if testing for a fissure that might not exist. Weather made choices for both sides, with ground haze tempering some afternoons and clear moonlit nights sharpening others. The diaries of transport supervisors, terse and factual, report days when goods reached the platforms despite everything, and nights when a single broken crane stalled an entire dock. Not because effort was lacking, but because the sequence had too many vulnerable joints. By late autumn, the sense that the island was learning how to bear continued pressure appeared in small rituals that gave shape to time. Tea served in shelters at the same hour each night, notices pinned in the same place each morning, and the decision to wash a floor even when dust would return by evening. Because a clean start mattered psychologically. This was not bravado, it was maintenance of order in the face of events that tried to make order feel pointless. The two traces, broadcast guidance and municipal ledgers, converge on a picture of an administration that understood the value of tone and of consistent delivery, and crews on the airfields reading the same broadcasts in mess halls. Sense that their families were being supported in ways that allowed them to focus on the next sortie rather than the last repair bill. These weeks also taught planners to trust dispersion over concentration and to value flexibility over tidy diagrams. And although such lessons are often declared in retrospect, the minutes of committee meetings from this period, with their short agendas and immediate decisions, indicate that adaptation happened in real time. As the first frosts formed on allotment fences and breath showed in the air after dusk, the raids persisted, but with intervals that felt longer. And the pressure on the network of fields and cities began to look less like escalation and more like endurance with limits. The bridge to the next scene lies at those limits, where the enemy recalculated objectives, where weather imposed boundaries, and where the island's defense entered a phase that some later described as a narrow escape and others as a pause taken by an opponent who had already turned to a different task. As autumn deepened into the final weeks of the year, the pattern of attack shifted again. And while cities still braced for nights that could flare without warning, the total weight of strikes seemed to thin at intervals that gave the defenders room to breathe, to rotate, and to repair. Station logs, one of the two reliable traces in this phase, show sorties continuing with regularity, but with slightly longer gaps between the heaviest days, and government memoranda that discussed coastal defense and inland production schedules, the second trace, suggest a recalibration of priorities informed by the recognition that trained personnel and spare parts could not be expended faster than they could be replaced. The island was not safe, but it was less brittle than before, and that difference matters in a campaign where the next week's capacity depends on today's caution. The official account that would be published later adopted the language of turning point, assigning weight to a few pivotal days and finding in them a kind of hinge. A parallel reading, grounded in the primary traces at hand, offers a quieter picture. The hinge did not swing in an instant, but moved gradually across weeks when weather grounded large formations, when inland targets drew attention away from the airfields at critical moments, and when the arithmetic of risk inside enemy planning rooms may have tilted toward restraint. Civilians did not experience this as victory, only as relief measured in longer stretches of sleep, in trams that ran through lunch without interruption, and in the discovery that a shop could reopen with fresh panes rather than taped cardboard. Fatigue remained real. Loss remained present, yet conversations turned slightly from emergency to maintenance, from crisis to continuity. Committees met to plan winter fuel allocations and to arrange repairs before snow. Neighborhood groups practiced moving elderly residents during alerts, not with the panic of August, but with routine acquired through repetition. In the air, crews found that their briefings once again included a margin for rest between launches, and mess tables carried notes about leaves that might be granted if the current tempo held. Such notes read like ordinary office chatter, but in context, they signal an institution that had pulled back from the edge. The enemy, still capable of punishing blows, did not press them in ways that threatened to break the defensive network entirely. and whether this restraint arose from strategic reconsideration, from competing fronts, or from losses that were harder to replace than anticipated, remains a matter of debate that our narrative acknowledges without settling. In public, the national voice remained measured and avoided triumphal tones, which helped guard against complacency. In private, letters began to mention small plans again: repairs to a roof, a holiday postponed rather than canceled, the hope that spring might bring work to a cousin recently displaced by damage at the docks. The city, once a nightscape of sparks and smoke, now felt like a patient set of districts making progress in daylight and defending itself at night with competence rather than shock. The island's sense of self, so often described in elevated language, shows here in mundane choices to reopen a market, to hold a council meeting, to replace a bell in a school that had lost its roof. None of these gestures carries the drama of a decisive clash, yet together they mark a widening of space between fear and function. The network of airfields, still alert, still patched with repairs, still watching the barometer and the line of the coast, drew confidence from the fact that crews trained in summer were now experienced, that procedures improvised in August had become practice, and that the winter weather, unpredictable as it was, sometimes favored the defender. The two traces that guide this reading, station logs and memoranda, also hint at the cost. Lists of names attached to duty rosters that changed too often. Notes about shortages that eased but did not vanish, and reminders to watch for fatigue, especially among those who had carried the heaviest sequences in September. The narrative does not draw a curtain here. It notes a measured reprieve and recognizes that a reprieve is not an end. The enemy remained across the channel, with plans that could be revised, with ships that could be loaded, with crews that would fly again when conditions suited. Yet the island stood without invasion, and for those who had lived through the summer's uncertainty, that fact alone justified the next day's work. Winter drew on, light stayed shaded, and the habit of looking up at sunset remained. Our bridge forward stays within the season and this coastline, moving from the capital's nights to the coastal watchposts and the coastal towns where the sea wind cut through greatcoats and the logs on the desk still began with the words weather, visibility, warnings, as the record turned to the closing notes of a year that had tested endurance more than any speech could name. By the close of 1940, the island had learned how to live under a sky that could change without notice. The rhythm of alert and response felt less like panic and more like practiced muscle, built from the smallest units of habit. National bulletins kept their calm timbre. Borough minutes recorded repairs, rehousing, and careful rationing. Station logs showed crews still flying, now with the economy of experience. The official reading would later shape this period into a turning point. A quieter interpretation suggests a chain of near misses, opportunistic pauses, and choices made under constraint on both sides. Two classes of paper hold the outline together: clipped memoranda that weigh manpower against hours, and municipal records that count beds and panes of glass. Between these lines sits the lived texture of that season: tea poured in shelters, chalk notes on doors, a tram rounding a corner on time after a long night. No final claim is offered here. The limits of knowledge are real. What seems credible is that measured endurance, enemy miscalculations, and weather combined to keep the island unconquered that year. What then followed for those who rose each morning to the same horizon, for those who planned in rooms where maps were quietly updated, and for those who counted every blanket and boot until the arithmetic finally worked? Did the coming months confirm a reprieve or compress pressure in a new direction that people had not yet imagined?